Hello, I am Isabeau, and welcome to our sixth PVT in our series on strategy. And I'm joined by Thibaut, who's the head of strategy at IQM.
Hi. Thank you for taking the time again to chat about strategy and all the weird things that are going on inside my head. Since last time, we both went off and thought about how to synthesize and combine the different principles that we've defined into something that we can present more easily to the team and evaluate potentially. And again, I was faced with the different approaches that we take to working on that kind of stuff, where you produce documents that are very detailed and relatively polished from a relatively early stage, whereas I work way more in, let's say, draft and bullet point stage if I think that is the level of detail that's needed. And I thought it might be interesting to come back to something that we touched upon in the first discussion that we had, which was the anecdote that I gave about restrictive systems versus systems that set a certain responsibility to the members of that system, and how the way that we define the things that we're talking about now fall also within that spectrum, and why sometimes we hit friction where I think it's not beneficial to increase the level of detail in which we document processes, because it falls into that level of becoming restrictive, and where certain people who don't feel comfortable, or whose preferred way of receiving instructions and of defining a context in which to work is not as detailed as your preferences. So of course, you mentioned correctly that in order to create a working environment where everybody feels comfortable, that includes you. And so we do also need an environment that is detailed enough, which makes it easy and comfortable for you to work in, without making it less comfortable for other people in the business. And so I think what I wanted to ask you to comment about was, I think my understanding, at least, of the level of clarity that you prefer isn't necessarily linked to what depth or what level of detail we go into, but is just that when we go to a certain level of detail, it's very clear that that's where the process or the definition stops. And from there, it's the responsibility of the person executing that process or following those principles to decide what they want to do, as long as that limit's very clear. Is that right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the part that would be good to be defined for myself when it comes to when we write documents, and the way that we write them comes out very different, or comes out with a very different level of description. Part of that is also due to the way that we work together. And so for myself, I think that I would have, I often am making documents more detailed or more kind of a final edit, even in the first edits, in part to try to be helpful to you, to try to, in my eyes, use up less of your time needing to review multiple iterations. And also from my side, the unknown for me is I'm not sure if in this certain process I'm going to get a chance to do a second edit. And so I'm wanting to show all the options, show all the things that this thing could be for you to see, not thinking that this is the final edit, but more of I'm wanting to put a lot into it because I'm not sure where it's going to go. And I'm probably not going to be part of the process moving forward. And so I'm wanting to throw everything at the wall and present the best, knowing that I might not be part of the next stage of the process. So for me, that defining the expectations when it comes to the steps in the process, obviously that the steps can always be changing, but if, say, in this case, hey, I'd love you to make a first draft of the principles and values of IQM, and just so we can get a look at what they are on paper, it'd be helpful if I then knew, okay, and after I look over this first draft, I'm going to bring you into the next steps, or I'll have you review mine, or I'll see kind of where that is, because I often am unsure where this is going, and so I'm not able to for myself determine how much effort I should put in. And so I often put too much.
Okay. I mean, I don't want to go into a discussion about specifically our collaboration. I think it's more interesting to talk about, not to say that that's not an important discussion to have, but this is not the forum for that. What I'm more interested in is, the level of detail that we need in our systems and processes so that we don't cause confusion and frustration by lack of clarity. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, what's the level of detail that we need to not cause frustration because they are too restrictive? I'm not exactly on the opposite side of the spectrum compared to you in terms of detail, because there are people in the business who want way less than I do. But we are different enough in our natural inclination to provide detail on certain processes, etc., that I think it's an interesting discussion to have and to see how we can create a system that is fit for purpose for both of us without creating frustration for the other. So if you have any thoughts on that, or if you could speak to that in terms of when is a process unclear or lacking detail to the point where it causes frustration in you, and what does that look like? Let's say in something as vague and philosophical as a principle, a guiding principle, or a value of the business.
So definitely part of my own bias flows into how I write documents, or the level in which I think is needed, which probably, like you said, is more than most. But I would say I do try to follow kind of the other things you spoke about, which is that doing things based off feedback. And so, and using that information to help guide what should be changed or should be changed or should be worked on. And I guess the part that I picked up when writing that document specifically was you saying and us discussing how vague this already is for the team and how little they currently understand these principles. And I know one of them we discussed was how you're totally okay if people's productivity or people's stress levels were decreased by them using new tools, even if that costs a business more money. And so for me, that's like, okay, I'm going to on paper write down like almost explicitly that, saying you can go to Thibaut, you can go to like leadership to bring up these things, because I feel like at least in these processes, the detail would be helpful from our conversations. I may be wrong. And I would then take the feedback from the team on what then to change. And if they saw, like, say they read my document and they then thought, oh, she provided examples of behaviors to do, and that means that I can never do any of their behaviors, then I can then take that and be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna change my document and change how I write things because it's coming off restrictive instead of it's coming off as examples or as helpful, detailed information. This is now getting, it's now not following our principles. But I will say, actually, for myself, I like those examples because so many things like ownership can mean something different to so many people, and so I want to kind of be able to provide some examples for people or to kind of give more detailed information. But again, I might be missing the mark in doing that.
So I think examples are always good. Your draft of the values and principles for me was not the quote unquote worst offender. It was just a trigger to think about that kind of stuff again. Discussions like the one we've had a few weeks ago. Should all recurring tasks have these settings so that we can standardize how all recurring tasks are used? For me, that goes a few steps too far into restrictive. How people configure their own tasks in ClickUp really doesn't cause massive issues for the business. And so that's too high level of detail in terms of instructions or norms or standards. I think having lots of detail in examples is not necessarily a problem. Then presentation just becomes a problem, right? Or not a problem. It's a question mark, because for me, the ideal is every principle is one or two sentences which are clear enough in themselves for people to get 90% of the meaning of what we want. And then we can have more examples which get them the remaining 8, 9% because we'll never get 100% clarity. That doesn't exist. We can have more examples that get them closer to that, but that is not part of the initial blurb that people need to digest. They digest the first blurb, and then they can answer their own questions, but they've digested that and they've understood it, rather than having to digest and understand everything in one go, which again, I think that potentially falls a little bit into storytelling and presentation and documentation, rather than the system design in itself, really. But it's adjacent, because the way we present the system says a lot about the system itself, and shapes people's perception of that system quite a lot.
Maybe the part that I'm missing, and it would be good for possibly the whole team as well, is to have a better understanding of when adding more detail helps a process, or when adding more detail is limiting behavior. Because I would say that a lot of my time since joining has been about, in my eyes, providing clarity or more information. So say the recurring task I have for prep for sprints, I've gotten quite a lot of good feedback on that, of that's so helpful that exists. And that for me is a process in which providing a task which has a detailed description in it of what you need to do, so you don't need to refer back to a document. It's just kind of all there for you, was helpful for the team. And so for me, I guess maybe sometimes I'm unsure of when process like that, it becomes helpful, or when I'm starting to restrict behavior because I'm now saying you only can do it one way, or there is the best way or the rightest way. I think clarifying which processes or which behaviors to add more clarity to, or which to not. Because what you've been just describing about the principles makes complete sense to me, and is what I'm hoping to give the team. I think that because at the moment the audience of that document would be the team that already has probably at times understood but just hasn't had the clarity. That's probably where I went too much into clarity, versus I think a document I would have made for someone who was just joining the company, and who we can kind of build that over time more. We're course correcting.
If I take Holacracy, right, the governance system that is a distant cousin of how we do stuff, but that was the system that we initially started with. So the way Holacracy defines roles is they give them a purpose and a domain, and that's it. Nothing more. And as you go, if tensions arise between two different roles, because they both have a different understanding of what needs to be done, or if one of them fails to deliver to the other role what the other role needs to be able to do their role, then you raise a governance tension, and an accountability is added to that role, or to whichever role, to say, essentially, this is a clarification of what we mean by the purpose and the domain. But it might very well be that two different people in those two same roles would have never had a need for that accountability, because they had a different understanding of those domains and purpose, which never made this governance tension arise. And so I think we basically need to start looking, and maybe this is something that is just relevant to us, right? And the rest of the business never needs to know about it, is that we look at the systems and the processes in that top level of purpose and domain, whatever we call it, the essence, right? The essence of the process, the essence of the system. And that's immutable-ish, right? To change that would require a really, really fundamental change in how we work as a business. And that's something that fits in a few sentences, probably, for each of those. And then beyond that, we have the level of accountability, which is essentially clarifications that have arisen from tensions. And I would say probably, I'm going to say 70% of our documentation is due to a clarification that comes out of a tension. I'd say probably about maybe 5 or 10% of our documentation is that essence. About 70% is clarification, maybe 5%, if that is examples. I don't think we have that many examples. And then the remaining, what is it, 20, 25% is probably faff, just noise.
That's great for me to kind of re-understand the essence of how we use tensions that is the same as the principles for holacracy and how they do roles and domains, because that is true. And why when we update our documentation is often based off the internal tensions. I'm trying to think of where do I find that the difference between or lack of information can lead to confusion. And I would say that because one of the principles is just like you just take ownership over your domain, you take ownership over your tasks. When things get forgotten, whose responsibility was it to remind somebody or to say something? Because I think there's times like that where someone's like, oh, I don't think that's mine to deal with. But then someone else also doesn't think it's theirs to deal with. And I think that, or someone accidentally oversteps because they thought that was something for them to deal with. Because I know that came up for myself with the recruitment process and steps that we were using, where I was telling you more about how I was reminding people and feeling an ownership over how the steps were playing out. And you spoke about how that wasn't my role in the recruitment, but I definitely thought it was. So for me, I guess that's where it would be helpful to understand.
I think there's a slight misnomer there when you're saying that's not your role, but that's okay. So I'll take it back to that holacracy principle, right? So the essence, the purpose and the domain, if for whatever reason we fail to adhere to that, that's a failure of the business, and we need to address that. For instance, one of the things that is essential to how we run the business is the fact that any work that we do is documented in the central system that we use for work and project management, ClickUp, right? If you do work and it is not represented in ClickUp for whatever reason, that's a failure, right? Because so much depends on it. That, for me, that would be like one of the essential things. It's a very practical example, but that will be one of the essential things. Now, we have defined, as part of countless internal tensions. I was looking at how many internal tensions we've implemented since we started tracking it, and it's like 350 or something already in like 3 years. That's like, 2 per week. It's quite a lot. Basically, when that happens and to what level of detail that happens, and potentially even who's responsible for making that happen. But I would say that kind of borders on that, and we'll get to your comment about role. Those are, for me, accountability parts. Those are, for me, that next level down of clarifications, where if, as a business, we do not adhere to that, it is not a problem unless it causes attention. So right now, this very moment, about every single one of our clarifications, that level of detail is being broken because of the period that we're in as business. Stuart's not keeping his ClickUp up to date to any level that I would expect of anyone in the business at the moment, because it's more important that we deliver that project. He is retrospectively updating it periodically, every like 2 or 3 days. Normally, I'd be on people's backs saying, why aren't your tasks up to date? Why are you dragging along 6 overdue tasks for the last 3 weeks? Blah, blah, blah. At the moment, that doesn't matter. That's not a failing as a business. It's that nobody's raising that as attention because they don't need that information right now. And they understand that other priorities mean that can be left aside for now. And that goes for pretty much everything. So if we say, these are your domains and these are your responsibilities within your domain. So for instance, one of those is, as the technical lead, if we are recruiting somebody with a technical profile, it is your responsibility, ultimate responsibility, to make sure that any candidate that we are considering to hire, we have a good idea of their technical skill so that we can make an evaluation of that. That is that person's responsibility, right? Ultimately, that we get to that result. How we get there is part of those clarifications, and who feeds into what in that process is part of those clarifications. And so depending on what's happening in the roadmap and where the business is at, more of that responsibility will be put on Stuart's shoulders, or more of that responsibility will be decentralized because we want to minimize the workload for Stuart. Now, the reason why I said you shouldn't be doing that is because at no point in time, ever, is it anyone's responsibility to remind anyone else to do their stuff. If somebody has not done what they were supposed to do, and it's causing a tension in you, then that's a tension, right? And they are failing at their role. But it's never going to be your responsibility to check up on someone and make sure they do their shit, because that is so fundamentally part of how we want people to behave within the business that it becomes a failing of that person if they do not deliver their final responsibility. It's a misnomer to say that it's not your role. It's because it's outside of that. It's never going to be somebody's role to check that somebody else has done their work, because that's so contrary to the culture and the principles of what kind of work culture we want at IQM. We don't want to check on people to make sure that they've done what they need to do. There will be moments where we realize that somebody hasn't done their work and we need that work. And so it's creating a tension in me. And so I'm raising that tension with that person saying, why haven't you done this? I need you to do this. But I want to be, I don't know if the distinction is clear.
I think what you're saying is clear to me. I think I still have confusion about how that applies in practical ways. For example, if there was something that had a time limit or a due date, I'm thinking about part of the, like, we're going to have interviews. We're going to interview these people when we're recruiting. And so we need to give them feedback by a certain time. We need to get them certain things for a certain time to follow our process. And is it my responsibility to help ensure that other people are doing their tasks in a way that does not delay my tasks, which are afterwards? I think that's where I get confused. Also, in part of that is if I'm asking something of somebody, I will need to be sometimes double checking with them if I've provided enough information for that to be well understood.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, those are the parts of, yes, I know there's kind of a lot of parts of the kind of manager oversight role that is not a part of how we want to run the company, but there is in part like just knowing that if someone's going to do something for the first time and someone's away and something's not done perfectly well, and like, you know, that something's a bit more like vague, that for something to be done well, I'm going to go up to them and be like, hey, do you understand what's going to happen? Like I'm going to sit in on this meeting with you because I want to just double check. That feels like a level of responsibility, but that we sometimes have to give. As you said, it's not someone's specific role or a role. I think there's part of the like miscommunication as humans and the making mistakes as humans that is their level of accountability that we hold each other to for those things. And that's for me where I feel drawn to do that, because I've been told probably by you or by someone else that there's a due date for this. And if I'm told it's a hard due date and I see someone else who's not going to complete their tasks on time, or someone else who's not understanding something, which means I wouldn't be able to complete my task on time, I feel that level of ownership and responsibility to clarify, to discuss with them, to remind them.
Okay, so because there's about 3 or 4 different elements in what you've just mentioned, and some of them are absolutely fine, and some of them are problematic for me. The checking in with somebody whether you have been clear in your expectations and like expressing your expectations and what you need from them is not a problem, right? That's great, as a matter of fact. it becomes a little bit problematic when you're double checking with someone whether they've understood a task that they've already done 8 times and you've already explained it 16 times and they're like, come on, I know. But that's like, I
Yeah.
don't think that's what's happening. So I don't see that specific part as a problem at all. So double checking with someone whether they've understood, whether the message has come across. Great, not a problem. If you see that by looking at the data specifically in ClickUp, I guess, and you, based on what you see in ClickUp, you think that something is not going to be done on time, that's borderline, right? Because if you have clearly communicated during planning or whenever something was raised as a disruption or something, if you have clearly clarified when something needs to be done by and what your expectations are for that thing, then it is the other person's responsibility to make sure that that gets done. And if they've understood it and they've planned in work, then it's not up to you to question that because you're not the one doing the work. So they might be faster than you. They might have different ways of doing something. They might still get it to you on time. So I'm not going to question. We have examples to the contrary.
I was gonna say I have a good example that I think might help on this is that I'm thinking of where I do have that data to show that they have not completed it.
Yep.
Because I've asked someone to do something and they've done it, but then I go to look at the information that asked them to review and they missed 5 things.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, gotta let them know.
And that's fine, right? And so this is where it feels weird, probably, is that until they failed, it's not up to you to make the call that they are going to fail. And if somebody has failed and you say, and of course there are exceptions to this, right? But you say, this cannot ever happen again. So let's say it was something very important, right? And the next time that it happens, it cannot happen like this again. Then you have a discussion about how to avoid that it happens again. And if you agree with that person that specifically they want you to remind them because whatever, or they want to have a regular check-in or whatever, then that's a measure that you put in place with them in agreement with them to help them succeed. Which, by the way, you can agree up front, right? So if you say, well, there's a big delivery that I need from you, let's do a weekly check-in or a monthly check-in to see how it's going. That's fine. That's something that you agree on and you make sure that you're going in the right direction. I would still say that you want to do that as little as possible, just from a reminder point of view. And we've done that with people who are bad at, let's call it project management, people who struggle with keeping ClickUp up to date and that kind of stuff. But I'm always loath to do that. And that's always a negative mark. If I have to sit with you every week and do something just to make sure that you do it, that behavior has to change very quickly. I'll do it with you for a few weeks, but that is only to get you into the saddle, right? That's never going to be the way we continue doing things.
Yeah. Do you feel that it is our responsibility as a business to teach that to those who might be lacking or missing that behavior skill? So as you said, project management, then that it's our job to be like, okay, we're noticing that 4 people are kind of not managing their tasks well, not managing the project well.
Yep.
You're all going to have like a little training session on project management.
I mean, project management might be a little bit of an ambitious term for what we're talking about, because essentially we're giving very bite-sized chunks to people most of the time, and it's just breaking those down and then keeping that information up to date in our system so that if somebody else needs to refer back to it, it's explicit enough for somebody to understand. The sort of minimum requirements, I think, are very, very reasonable. And it's when those fail that we have those discussions about, okay, this is part of what we expect you to do when you're owning your domain. The larger project management part, that's more of a role, as in, or domain, that's more of a skill, right? And so, yes, to a certain extent, I expect everybody to have that to a minimum level, but I don't expect everybody to be able to manage a 3-month project with multiple stakeholders. That's not part of the domain for everyone. The last thing that I want to come back on from what you mentioned, specifically with that example of recruitment, is where ultimately there is, and that's a domain question, there is a confusion or misunderstanding in ultimately what the limit or the definition of the domain is. So the example you mentioned is that it's your responsibility to communicate to candidates what the result was of their technical test in this case, right? And so you are right to feel responsible for being able to deliver that result. Now, in part, to be able to deliver that result, you need from the technical lead the evaluation of the technical tests. And as part of the technical leads, or the tech domains owner in our new terminology, it is their responsibility to evaluate every candidate. So to make sure that every candidate that we interview gets an evaluation on their technical skills. So it is the person who owns the technology domain. It is their responsibility to make sure that that happens. And it is your responsibility to make sure that we're communicating to the candidates. Now, there's an accountability there from the technical domain to the recruitment domain. But when you're sitting in a meeting to make sure that it happens, that's so far from how we want to do things as a business that really causes attention in me, right? And that's why I probably had a relatively assertive reaction to that, because it is not your domain to make sure that the technology domain does what they're supposed to do. That is nobody's domain ever. And so, yes, it causes attention in you if you are not able to deliver what you need to deliver because somebody else has failed. And that's a valid tension. But attention cannot be a future tension. So you cannot raise attention about something that hasn't happened yet. That is part of the definition of what attention is, right? So if you look at something and you're like, I think that's going wrong, but it's somebody else's domain, somebody else's responsibility to make sure that it does happen, you can't step in and think and say, I think that's going wrong. Now, of course, I understand that there are scenarios where this is not feasible, right? If something is catastrophically going to go wrong, which might mean the end of the business, and I'm looking at it and everybody's looking at it and we all see it go wrong, but it's somebody else's responsibility and they're just like sinking the whole business. Of course, we're going to do something about that, right? But I would say in the vast, vast, vast majority of the cases, it is better to watch it fail, right? Watch the Titanic hit the iceberg and then learn from that moment, because that is the responsibility of the person who's not seen the iceberg. Because if you start doing that kind of stuff, people become reliant on it. Humans are intrinsically super lazy. And as soon as you do stuff for them, so they have to dedicate less brain power, less time, less attention to it, they're going to start relying on it. And so I don't want to create any of that, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I think for myself, I have an incredibly hard time being an iceberg approach and being like, not mine to say, because that's how it feels for me. In this situation, like I can speak on all the variables and the reasons why I thought this wasn't going to happen well. And then the second part of that is because our principles and our values are constantly being prioritized specifically on certain things. Like, of course, there's an ownership over being able to click up and do that. But currently we understand that Stuart has higher priorities of other things, and we want him to have higher priorities of those other things. We're okay with it kind of not being as kept up to date. I think for me, and I think for most of the not in the decision makings about what is the priority of employees, we're not aware if that's what's happening. So in this situation, I didn't know if, because I have less on my plate, this was a helpful thing I could do to take ownership over something specifically in this moment that I normally wouldn't. if we were in another situation where they had more time.
Okay, but so again, I think it's important. This is semantics, and I might be really, really pedantic about this, but you sitting in a meeting to see it happen is not you taking ownership, because you cannot do the work. It's still somebody else doing the work. So you sitting there and looking at it. Now, I just want to clarify something, right? I do not dispute that what you did yielded a better result than if you hadn't done it. I just want to make that very clear, that I fully understand that what you did made it so that the recruitment process went smoother, that the candidates got their feedback on time, and that stuff happened the way it was supposed to happen. So I don't dispute neither your observation nor the result of what happened. I just want to make that clear. So it's really just
Okay.
like a principle and philosophical thing here.
Mhm.
But I think it's important because, and this goes back to, I think the second PVT where we talked about, well, how do we build that trust? And I said consistency, right? And so I think this is one of the examples of where you have to be consistent, even if you see the iceberg. And the the reality is that actually a lot of the time the iceberg is either smaller than you thought, or actually going to be missed because the people in the team that we work with are competent and do get their shit done. There are exceptions, and I know that the specific anecdote that we talk about, you did check with Stuart and Boyan, and they confirmed that they had misunderstood or not allocated enough time, or something like that. I don't remember the exact details, but so that's why I'm saying I know that it would have gone wrong if you hadn't stepped in. But that shouldn't, I'm still going to be adamant about the fact that that shouldn't be the reflex and that shouldn't be the behavior. It might very well be that you have a discussion with Stuart and you ask, what can I do to help you? I know you have a lot on your mind. And he says, well, just remind me of what I need to do. And then that's fine. But again, it shouldn't become a permanent pattern, and it shouldn't be something that you spontaneously do for other people without doing, because you remind me of stuff, and that's one of the best ways to trigger me, is to basically tell me that you don't trust that I'm going to get my shit done, right? And I know that's not what you're doing, that's not the intention, but that's what I'm hearing, right? And so that's why
Mhm.
I'm I'm pretty adamant about that as a principle, as an extension of, we want people to take ownership, we want to give people responsibility done rather than restrict them, etc.
I think the part that was missing that led to me overstepping or thinking I should be taking on these different responsibilities was because the part that was missing for me in this process was everyone understanding who they were accountable to communicate with. And so I think I felt that there was going to be a lack of communication if I didn't initiate it, and that I was not going to be properly informed if I didn't. We hadn't had a discussion before of it is the responsibility of Boyan and Stewart to then communicate with Isabeau that they have completed the task, that they haven't needed extra time, that they've done all these things. And then Isabeau can then go check if it has been done correctly and she will get back to them. I think that is the part that I feel maybe is missing, is the communication side. It kind of goes back to what I spoke at the beginning about our different versions of the pencils and visions, is that if I understood where the communication and accountability was moving forward in the process, I would feel more assured by the lack of information.
So I think that, this whole discussion, you could argue, has nothing to do with a specific domain competence or like a technical expertise. These are all what I would consider to be either human skills or, you know, the extension of some of those values, principles, work ethic, that kind of stuff. And so that was something that I wanted to kind of touch on. And we're almost at the end of our time already, so maybe we need to have another discussion about how this looks for some of those other principles. But all of these principles that we are talking about are essentially human behavioral principles. And so those are the things that we are going to evaluate people on. And that, but part of that we talked about in one of the last discussions, I don't exactly remember which one, I think we mentioned it a couple of times, is that is also going to be one of the ways for the team to evaluate people in higher role, in higher levels of responsibility, higher domains. They're all to do with human behavior and human skills, rather than to do with your technical competency. So we're always going to consider that technical skills are something that can be learned or complemented by another person on the team, by hiring an additional person, somebody who has a more narrow field of expertise complementary to yours, that kind of stuff. Whereas these principles and these domains that we talk about, those are behaviors that in everybody's domain we want to see alive. And what we talked about last time a little bit is that some of those domains are harder to execute really on an individual level and really come to light at an organizational level. So, money as a tool, if you don't have any budget to your disposal, is hard, not entirely impossible, but it's hard to really live that. Whereas owning your domain and those kind of things, which we just spent better part of an hour talking about, those are things that we really want to see in everyone. And that if we don't, they will become a potential tension. And so I think that's also something that I wanted to clarify, is that the anecdote that we've talked about, for me, that whole discussion was not a criticism of what you did, because a lot of these things and these specific applications, that was the first time that you and I talked about them in that level of detail and in that level of application. I mean, when, after that happened. And so because we didn't have a very clear system with examples and all that kind of stuff in place, it's normal that everybody on the team is going to stumble across a line that they didn't know was there. And maybe I didn't know was there until I see it and I look at it and I go like, that doesn't seem right. Why doesn't that seem right? Let me try and backtrack, retrofit it, reverse engineer it back to, oh, maybe it doesn't fit with one of those principles. And now we've clarified it. So essentially, unless something was very clear, the first time that you're going to cross a line is, for me, always going to be a moment to clarify where the line was. Now, if something like that happens and I've pointed and I said, I think there's a line here, and you look at the line and you go, yep, I see that line there. And then a few weeks later or a few months later, you cross the line again. Now we have a problem, right? Because we knew that that line was there. We've defined it. But the first time, and I think that's part of this whole discussion around what level of detail do we need, is that I'm going to assume that the essence is good enough. And I know it's not, but I'm going to pretend like the essence is good enough for everybody to behave in exactly the way that I expect them to behave. I say I, but and then if somebody crosses the line, then we're going to sit down and we're going to look at those principles and we're going to be like, okay, do we need a clarification either for you or business wide to say, actually, this bit is the line on that specific principle. And I would rather have lots of those conversations rather than spending a lot of time up front to think about all the scenarios where people might cross the line preemptively and create a really large document and say, you need to now know all of these exceptions so that you exactly know up front where the line is. I would much rather people try stuff and take initiative, because, the example that we talked about, you felt responsibility for your domain and the result that you were going to deliver, and you took initiative to make sure that you were able to deliver that result. That's a great motivation, and that is exactly the kind of stuff that we want you to deliver. Now, the way that you did that created a conflict with some of those other principles that we've put in place. And so I can't fault you for your intention and what you've achieved to do. I just want to clarify why the way that you've implemented it creates another tension in me. And now we've clarified that between ourselves, we've got a better understanding of that. And moving forward, we are going to be more aligned in how we act. And this discussion, it's very likely that I'm going to have this same discussion with someone else in the next few years because they do something very similar to that specific anecdote. And I would much rather have that discussion again rather than now write it down for everyone to be like, this is what you need to do. Does that make sense? I think to sort of loop the loop.
It does make sense. I guess maybe one last question I have from that is realizing as we're discussing kind of what was my motivation as well as because like it's coming from my own principles where I had that drive, and it comes from my own internal principle of I'm okay with sacrificing my own time and energy if it means setting other people up for success, or I think it'll set up more other people for success. So how would you deal with someone like me coming into this company? Is there more information you have to be sharing with them? Is there more information I have to clarify up front where I have to share that saying, hey, I'm self-aware enough to know that I have this inclination of if I think something can go better by me putting more effort in for somebody else, I'm probably going to do that more often than what is seen as the right choices following our principles.
So, in itself, that is not a bad thing, right? That you want to be helpful and you're willing to step in to help other people in the business. If anything, that's a really positive thing. The pitfall of that, I would say, from my values, right, from how I look at it, is that certain people with certain pitfalls will consciously or unconsciously take advantage of that and end up with failing on one of our principles, which is to own your domain, right? So if somebody's really busy and you don't have that much on your plate and you're saying, well, let me help you with that, awesome, right? That's what we want. If somebody needs to deliver something and we haven't agreed that because they have too much on their plate, we're going to shift part of that ownership to you, really ownership, but they effectively delegate the responsibility to you and the ownership to you because they're like, and you step in and you make sure that it happens. To me, that is potentially problematic because it establishes that precedent of I don't have to do it because if I don't, Isabeau will step in and do it for me. And so, I mean, I think back to your question of, well, if we hire someone else who has those similar inclinations, do we need to clarify? Maybe, like you mentioned, it requires a certain level of self-awareness to be able to say, these are my values and these are the strengths of those values and these are the pitfalls of those values. And we could have a list or whatever, I guess a list of if this is your natural inclination, be aware of this. I would say if this was a system that was well established and we were a larger organization with enough resources so that we could dedicate people to specifically to maintain this system in its most functional form possible, then I think that will be a really cool resource, right? To say, let's do whatever we need to do to establish some kind of psychological value-driven profile of you. And based on that, we're going to tell you what you're probably going to struggle with within the business, what you're probably going to find easy, what are things that you need to pay attention to because you might accidentally do wrong, That would be really cool. I think that in order to do that well, that would take quite a lot of time and resources to get that right, because you need a good initial observation of a person to then match against those observations of ours. We don't have a huge amount of data. We have anecdotal data in any sense that you think about it of how certain people behave within this system. So I think as an idea, that would be really cool. As part of that, the idea of, if we can scale this beyond IQM, even if IQM stays small, then that's also success. If that is a model or data that we can export and show to the world, I think that would be really cool. I think in its current stage, probably as part of onboarding, we should, I know we probably need a minimum period of time to sort of get a feel for what type of personality somebody is. But then to have them sit down with somebody who is similar enough to them in certain aspects and just have them share their experience of what it means to work in an environment like IQM from that perspective. If I look at our latest hire, he has a reasonable amount of similarities to how Stuart used to function and potentially still functions, but Stuart's much better adapted, let's say, to how we work. And so it might make sense for them to have a conversation about, well, we align on these values or on this work ethic or on these principles.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I see them meshing with how IQM works, where you potentially see issues or tensions still. Maybe you can take some of that. So, a more ad hoc, human, subjective approach rather than necessarily mapping it out as a matrix or a list or something. I don't know. Does that kind of fit with what you were asking or what you had in mind?
I think those are all different ideas we could use to approach that. Principles or values of being able to communicate well, kind of on all levels, being able to bring up things that you need or questions or ideas. I would say that is where that is taught currently, and that is how we catch my pitfalls, or I bring up my confusions and about understanding if I am aligning or not aligning with certain principles. And so I would say that that is the most important principle, with knowing we're not defining things and not adding lots of rigid rules. That communication side is even more important, and maybe that's something we have to focus more on onboarding. I think we do actually work on communication skills often in the business, and so I would say that that's just something for us to continue to do.
We've had a number of discussions about communication and, well, most of sort of the work principle related stuff. But I do that with most people, and I adjust how I do that to how that person communicates or what I think that person's communication preference is, etc. But most people within their first 3 to 6 months will receive a few, hey, by the way, I've observed this. Maybe you want to try this. Da, da, da. And part of that, part of the reason why we have people become the vice O master, so to run our daily and weekly meetings, team meetings, is because that puts them in a situation where they have to communicate a lot, so we can observe a lot and we can give them feedback on that, and they establish their rapport with different people, because everybody runs it very differently. How Dom ran it compared to how Richard runs it is very different vibe. It's still the same meeting, right? We're still achieving the same result, but it's a very different vibe. And so I wonder whether there is any value in making that more explicit or apparent, because I do that, but nobody would know that I do it with somebody else if I didn't. Initially you only see what feedback you get from me directly, and I don't know if anybody else does that in the business, by the way. It might very well be that lots of people give each other feedback about communication. I have no idea, right? But I don't know if that is something that we need to make more apparent, to encourage more people to do it, or to give people more confidence in that is something that we are trying to improve as a business. I don't know. Or if that would be irrelevant and just noise.
The quick idea I have now, knowing we're running out of time, so making it quick, is I would say the side that I see that has the most room for improvement is the feedback side, is creating comfortable and safe environments to give feedback to other people on their communication, positive and negative. So if someone's running a meeting and you are like, oh, the way that they say this, it doesn't make me feel great. Having a space to share that with them that's not in the meeting, or a space where you can confidently also share, hey, I've really enjoyed how you've been running this. I feel like that's maybe where people don't know where they stand. And I'll speak for just myself, where often where I would love feedback on, I think that went really well, that first thing that you've done on something, or, oh, I think that actually, if you did this would make it be way better for me. That would help me out so much.
I mean, I think the intention we have for the D&I chat and how we said, we want to apply it a little bit more to work skills, quote unquote, based on that in-person chat where everybody was like, oh, I didn't know how that would go, but actually it went really well when we had everybody give feedback to everybody, in a matter of like an hour it was or something. So
I thought it was one of the best parts for myself. I know I'm big on that. Yeah, super helpful for me.
So, that means, that anecdotally means that everybody's okay with both giving and receiving feedback. And it means that, that's essentially a skill we can just practice. If we do it more often, like everything else, people get more comfortable with it, and then we don't have to formalize it as much. So hopefully, I mean, I would agree with you, right? Hopefully, if we manage to rejig the D&I session in a way that does that more, then we'll get a bit more of that. If that doesn't work, we'll try something else.
And I'm just wanting to say that I'm not meaning that it's the negative feedback that's always the most helpful.
No.
Actually, one of the parts that was most impactful about that for me was realizing that some people had nothing they wanted to share with me because they were happy working with me. And that's just great to hear, because I don't know. Like, it's not what we talk about normally of like, actually, I really enjoy working with you. Or, oh, you do this in a great way and it makes my job easier. And so, yeah, presenting the feedback as an opportunity to share feedback, but also an opportunity to share the parts of working with that person that makes it more enjoyable to be part of IQM is good too.
Yep. No, I agree. I think we can improve, and let's think of ways that we can integrate that into the way we work. We've tried a number of things. None of them have really stuck, so just keep trying.
It's been a great chance to talk more on more specific examples of how our principles are applied, or how we kind of miss the mark on our principles, and how we even course correct in those situations. So I think that's been great for people to learn and understand, because it doesn't just apply to me. I think that people can see that, especially in our first examples of how that would relate to their own jobs within the company, or anyone can see how they could apply that externally. So thank you for taking this time. And thank you everybody for watching.
Yeah, I think it's also worth thanking you for accepting to be the use case, because it's not easy to take an anecdote or an example where we're taking that as an example of something that we don't want to happen, but to take that with grace and to be able to interact with it as like, well, great, we're learning as a business from that. And like I said, I don't see it as a criticism of you, but it can be very easily perceived as that. So kudos.
Well, thank you. And I don't take it as a criticism.
Great. All right.
I just think of how things are going to go better because of it.
Awesome.